Well, I'm not talking about the recession virus, all those viruses, or the George Floyd reaction viruses, or the quarantine virus, or the election virus, but the woke virus. That is the idea that somewhere in this annus terribilis of 2020, we collectively lost our mind and we said that we're going to adopt the culture and the code and the values of the Salem witch trials, the reign of terror in 1793 in France, and the McCarthyite period in the United States, where we're going to cancel a person out if we find one incorrect thought or utterance, and we're going to completely reject the civil rights movement and the visions of Martin Luther King. So the color of our skins is and very at the critical requisite of who we are, and not the content of our character. So that's where we are. And we know from Iraq and Rwanda and the Balkans where that leads. It leads to nihilism, deadly nihilism.
So this is interesting. There's been a lot of discussion about critical race theory. Of course, this is one of the sort of ideologies, kind of behind what you're talking about. And, of course, there's this element where the people who are advocates will say, well, you don't really understand what it is, and so forth.
Well, critical means that it's critical of the norm, and theory means that it can't be proved, so it's not a fact, it's a suspicion. And it started there were elements of Marx and Freud. Think of that. Those are the two, I think, pernicious thinkers of the 19th century. And Marx said that all of human experience can be defined as oppressor versus oppressed, or victim versus victimizer. There is no middle class. If there is a middle class, it's only the deluded who think they're middle class. So there's this tension. And anybody who has things got them ill-gotten gains, what we call now under critical race theory, unearned privilege. And then there are the people who have a right to take it from them and redistribute it. Okay, that was the Marxist end. And then Freud came along and said, what you and I are doing right now is not who we are. These are just superficial manifestations of deep-seated urges. If we were under psychoanalysis or we got drunk, the real us would come out. The hang-ups that we use to suppress our inner self cannot be taken seriously. And that was very important because critical theory then adopted the idea that norms are not only to be termed them versus us, but what people say cannot be trusted. So if you say, I'm not racist, I've never said the N-word. And they said, yes, but you said colored people instead of people of color. That suggests to me that deep down inside you really wanted to say the N-word. Or you live in a certain way that is systemically racist. You don't know it, but I'm trained to fathom it. So a critical racial theory workshop specialist can, in Freudian fashion, can find your symptoms and then say, ta-da, he's a racist. It's insidious. It's systemic. So those were the two fountainheads of critical theory. And then when you add the third necessary component of World War I and World War II, where Europe committed collective suicide. You saw it in painting, poetry. After World War I, they took something like Impressionism, which was a takeoff on classical reality, and then they went into Dadaism and Surrealism and got into Jackson Pollock. Well, art never looked like anything the eye saw. Poetry didn't rhyme. It had no particular vocabulary. T.S. Eliot had seemed radical, and he would be, conservative he was very soon compared to what was called poetry. You could throw anything on a page, just like you could with paint, and it was a poem. So, and then there were certain schools that grew up in that general period of depression. And then this accelerated in World War II. I mean, when the French army, the bulwark of the West, Churchill's great faith that stopped Nazism, the very country that said they shall not pass at Verdun, collapsed in 6 weeks in 1940, in May and June. How do you explain that to future generations? You don't. So you come up with this French post-structuralism, postmodernism that you really either didn't collapse or that it believed in fake laws or traditions. You say anything other than what an empiricist would say, well, it was inevitable because you were teaching in the 1920s it was illegal to mention Verdun in a positive sense. You just said it was a nihilistic bloodbath rather than the French army saved France from Germany. And so socialism was deeply embedded, and this is the net logical fruition. So what I'm getting at is that a lot of people, to explain reality that they did not like or they could not accept, took earlier Freudism, Marxism, and then critical theory was born in the Frankfurt School and Gramsci, and then that became critical legal theory. We saw that in the 1980s, in which people said, originally there were elements of truth in it. If you snort cocaine and you're wealthy, you go 5 years to prison. If you cook it and it's crack cocaine, you go 20 because you're black. Well, there may have been some truth to that. So, but they expanded that to all of Western jurisprudence, that you don't look at the law and you don't look at the manner in which the law was made. You look at who benefits and who suffers from the law, and then therefore you adjudicate it whether it has any moral or legal authority. And that was very important because the whole sanctuary city movement, where you nullify federal law, is based on a racist, oppressive federal immigration law. And notice what was ironic about it was nullification of law was always a right-wing concept, so the left told us. It was what Andrew Jackson tried to fight with South Carolina in 1832. It was what caused the Civil War. It was what George Wallace said in the door at the University of Alabama when he said, I don't have to follow federal law. This is a states' rights. Suddenly states' rights became great. You can nullify federal law because it's for a noble purpose. So it was relativism par excellence. That's where we are, where every single idea is not factually based. And it's I'm not exaggerating. I'm getting back to that earlier point. So if you have data that say, let's take an example, that non-white minority groups commit hate crimes against whites and each other at higher rates in the population, the higher rates than in their percentages of the population than whites, that's a data point. It doesn't matter. It's whites are responsible for that because they have set up arbitrary norms of assessing that data, and they don't tell you that a 22-year-old African-American male in New York walked up and took a hammer and hit an Asian because he felt depressed or he was exploited, or the larger society who created him is responsible. And that's what critical race theories tends to do.